Hey, what's up? This is Scott with the Little Tutorials, and in this video, this is What is Wednesday, and today we're going to be talking about GraphQL. What is GraphQL? Hopefully I'll have that answered very quickly for you here. And before we get going, I want to say, if you want to learn a little bit more about GraphQL over the course of an hour or so, the syntax.fm, the syntax podcast, which is Wes Boss and myself, we just did an entire episode on GraphQL. So if you watch this video and you think, hey, that sounds cool, I want to learn a little bit more, head over to syntax.fm, check out the latest episode is on GraphQL. So with that said, let's actually answer this question. What is GraphQL? Now, GraphQL is a query language. In fact, that's what the QL would stand for. It's a query language for your API that's entirely unlike anything that you've ever used before in terms of a standard API. So in other APIs that you would hit to get data, let's say you want to fetch data from the YouTube API, and you can say, hey, YouTube, give me this information. Now, the way those typically work is that you have a specific endpoint or URL that you're hitting. And that URL determines what data comes back. And you can pass in options to that URL, and that can change the shape of the data or maybe what comes back in it. But at the end of the day, with a normal, what's called a REST API, you fetch a URL, and that URL is returning typically something like JSON or a JavaScript object full of data. And so this is how it's worked for a while now, right? Before that, we worked with XML and stuff like that, and now APIs have typically been essentially just REST APIs for a long time. Now, what makes GraphQL new and exciting and different? Well, GraphQL aims to improve upon those sort of ideas. So instead of an API where you hit a URL and just accept whatever data is coming back, GraphQL allows you to ask for specific kinds of data. This might be hard to see with the screen size, but in this example that's on the graphql.org, you can see that we've defined the way our data looks, right? It's a project with a name, a tagline, and contributors. Then you ask for what you want, right? So this is the actual query. So instead of hitting an API and just accepting data, you say, hey, give me the project with a name of GraphQL and return the tagline. Okay, and then the results come back with exactly what you asked for, which is an object with project and tagline, rather than just a whole bunch of stuff maybe you asked for or didn't ask for. Now, in addition to filtering out fields that you aren't necessarily going to use, GraphQL allows for really excellent relational queries. And I'll show you what I mean here in a real environment in a second, that allows you to, well, save trips. For instance, the YouTube API, I keep going back to this one, but the YouTube API, you hit it and you get a list of videos, which is essentially the video IDs. But if you want all of the information about that particular video, you have to then go back to the API and you have to say, oh yeah, so okay, I got this ID, but now that I have this ID, hey YouTube, once more, tell me all of the information about this video. With GraphQL, you can do this extremely relational queries that only make it so you have to do one trip to the API, data comes back. Okay, so GraphQL is a query language. It's a way to get data from an API into your application. So who owns GraphQL? Well, GraphQL is actually a specification. And the fact that GraphQL was created by Facebook is one of those things that can worry people. They can say, well, I don't want to use some Facebook technology because of maybe Facebook's reputation. Now Facebook has some of the best engineers around, and they have some amazing projects. So I don't personally agree with that, but I understand it. So if you don't want to use Facebook's code, that's the best part, is that GraphQL is a specification. It's not an implementation, as in you don't see and install GraphQL anywhere on this site. That's because to use GraphQL, you need to use an implementation of GraphQL. And one of the coolest things about it is that because it's just a spec, there's competition in the implementation space. So you're not stuck using Facebook's projects, and there's room for a lot of interesting ideas. Not only that, but you can use GraphQL on any sort of platform. So if we went to the code part of the site, you can see that GraphQL is sort of two parts, right? There's the server component and there's the client component. Now, if an API has a GraphQL server that already exists, you can just use that with only client-side GraphQL. And you don't need to learn the server-side stuff. But if you're building a full stack app, such as level up tutorials, you need a server library as well. So the cool part about GraphQL, again, is that there's just all this choice here. So you can see that we go to server libraries, and there's categories where you can find GraphQL implementations in all of these different languages. And if I were to select JavaScript, you can see that, well, we have some options. GraphQL.js, Express GraphQL, we have Apollo server, which is what I'm using, and all of these are great because, again, it gives us options to use something different. Let me explain a little bit about what the GraphQL server actually does. The GraphQL server essentially takes in your API. You write your API as a series of type definitions, so you're defining the shape of your data, and resolvers, which is stuff like a query, right? If I say, get me the tutorials, that's going to be in the resolvers. And then the server sort of takes all of that stuff in and exposes your GraphQL API via an endpoint. Remember I mentioned that typical REST APIs, you have to hit an endpoint, right? Well, with GraphQL, you hit one endpoint and then ask for the stuff you want. So we only have one particular endpoint, which is typically /GraphQL, but you can actually set it to be anything you'd like. And that's the GraphQL server, right? And allows you on any sort of server environment to be able to expose this information. The flexibility of GraphQL in an implementation like Apollo is absolutely amazing. Now, in addition to having server libraries or implementations, there's also GraphQL clients, which is the front-end component of it. This is where you actually are able to accept the queries on the front end, connect to the GraphQL endpoint, and ask for the data you want to receive. And again, with JavaScript, there's a lot of them. If you want to use Facebook's own code, there's a Facebook framework called Relay. If you want a potentially easier to get started option, there's the Apollo client, which is actually made by the folks from Meteor, the Meteor development group. And Apollo client is, honestly, it's what I'm using. It is super duper excellent. You don't need to know it. It's not connected to Meteor at all, so if those words scare you, don't worry about it. Apollo client is a great way to get set up and be able to query from a GraphQL endpoint. Okay, so I've been talking primarily from the viewpoint of JavaScript. So if you are not a JavaScript developer, it's okay. All of this stuff is still applicable. You can see Go, GraphQL. And one of the cooler things is that some of these, like Apollo, you can see there's Apollo Android, there's Apollo iOS. Some of these are cross-platform like that. And if you can use one thing for a whole bunch of different front ends, that seems like a sweet spot to me. So, okay, I've talked a little bit about GraphQL and what it is and how it works. Let's actually see some GraphQL in action. This is the actual Level Up Tutorials GraphQL API. Now here, you can see I wrote a simple query that just says, say, and the data returns back as hello world. Now this is stupid because it's simply just returning a string. It's not even hitting the database. But let's actually see some of these relational queries in action. For instance, on the Level Up Tutorial site, I have playlists and I have tutorials. And some of this information is relational, and sometimes I would have to hit two APIs and maybe combine some data to get this to do what I wanted to, or I had to have some custom code on the back end and the API to return all of this information. But what GraphQL makes it easy to do is write one sort of query and make it flexible. For instance, let's say I'm on a tutorial page and I just want, let's do tutorials, okay, which is going to return an array here. And let's say I just want the title. It's going to give me the title of every single tutorial in my database. That's amazing. Now let's say I want Now, let's say I actually want to get the playlist. Now, the playlist is actually in an entirely separate collection, but I've written my API so that if I ask for a playlist, I can say, hey, now that I have the playlist, give me the playlist title, and hit go. And just like that, not only do I have the tutorials, but I also get the title and the playlist with the title. And just by describing the shape of a playlist or describing the shape of a tutorial, I could now ask for anything within this playlist object. I could even ask if the user bought this series and say, hey, did the user buy this series? You can see, yeah, hey, I bought this one, but no, I didn't buy this one. Bought it? No. So this is, you can see, just a small little example, but the query language here is absolutely unreal for getting the right data you want very quickly. Now, in addition, this little interface here is called GraphQL, and this thing is a way to test out and write your queries. Another key thing in GraphQL, because this thing right here allows you to make sure your queries are working and the data is coming in exactly as you'd expect. You can copy and paste right out of here into your code. Okay, so a lot about GraphQL here. Let's talk a little bit about implementations. Now, my favorite implementation is the Apollo client. So if you want to head to GraphQL.com. Again, nothing against Relay. To be honest, I haven't dove into it more than just looking at the doc. So if Relay looks like your thing, go ahead, man. I just really like Apollo. The documentation for this stuff is great. So again, check out Apollo if you're interested in, just messing around with GraphQL here. Now, okay, let's scroll down and let's talk about some other little things that are kind of interesting. We went over these in the syntax podcast again, so watch that or listen to that if you are interested in some more stuff. But we have things like Graph CMS, which is going to be really cool. It's going to look like, it's essentially like a WordPress backend, and all it does is expose a GraphQL API. So then what you would do is, connect to that API, write your queries, and get your data. Now, this seems like an excellent modern implementation of how you could write a backend on a service and then write your front end and have them talk to each other. Really like something like this. And we also have something called GraphQL, which is kind of similar without the backend. It's a GraphQL backend with no interface, where Graph CMS has a beautiful interface, right? So this is if you don't need that, or maybe it's not like a client-facing interface. This allows you to write a GraphQL backend and query it on the front end and not have to worry about the database layer or anything like that at all. So with GraphQL, there's a ton of cool stuff. Now, also, if you've been following Level Up Tutorials, you've probably seen some tutorials on Gatsby, which is a static site generator for React using GraphQL. So this, again, is you write your queries in GraphQL, and then when you generate the site, it uses that to fill in your data. Again, some cool stuff with GraphQL. Again, GraphQL is a specification for a query language, okay? It's just saying how it should look and work. The implementations are things like Relay and Apollo. So to use GraphQL, you have to use an implementation of GraphQL. I highly recommend just coming to graphql.code, click, I think it's code here, and then look into your languages, check out the libraries, and see how you can get started. It's all seriously cool stuff. If you would like to learn GraphQL in the context of React and Meteor and JavaScript and Node and all that good stuff, there's actually a free series on Level Up Tutorials right now that's going to show you how to connect Apollo to Meteor's account system. And again, if you're afraid of Meteor, don't worry. We're mostly using Meteor for the build tool, the server, and the account system. None of the other stuff within Meteor, and it'll be a very lightweight app here that we're building. But if you want to do that, that's a free series that's up on leveluptutorials.com right now. If you want to learn more about GraphQL overall, there's going to be a ton of premium content on Level Up Pro this year. So sign up to become a pro at leveluptutorials.com/pro. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.